The heat in the Arizona territory did not just sit on the skin, it burrowed into the pores, thick and suffocating, tasting of copper and ancient dust. Inside the stagecoach, the air was stale, recycled by the labored breathing of 6 passengers who had spent the last 3 days jostling against one another's shoulders. Lydia Barrett sat squeezed into the corner seat, her gloved hands folded so tightly over the leather satchel on her lap that her knuckles had turned the color of old parchment. She was 26 years old, a dangerous age for a spinster in Philadelphia. But out here, amidst the red rocks and the vast, empty sky, she felt ancient. "Red Mesa up ahead," the driver hollered, his voice cracking over the thunder of hooves. Lydia's heart gave a painful lurch against her ribs. This was it, the end of the line, the end of the world. Really, beside her, an older woman with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen too many hard winters shifted her weight. She had spent the last 50 miles watching Lydia with a mixture of pity and cynicism. "You hold on to that paper like it is a scripture, child," the woman said, her voice low, meant only for the small space between them. Lydia glanced down at the envelope protruding from her satchel. Inside was a marriage contract, signed, notarized, and paid for. "It is my future," Lydia whispered, her throat dry. "Mister, Elias Thorne is waiting for me." The old woman made a sound that was half laugh, half cough. "Men out here, they are not like the ones back east. A contract is just paper. If he decides he does not like the look of your teeth, or if the harvest was bad, or if he simply drank away his steak last night. Well," she leaned in closer, smelling of stale tobacco and peppermint. "A woman without a man in the territories is treated like surplus goods, and surplus goods rot quickly in this heat." Lydia stiffened, straightening her spine against the hard cushion. "Mr. Thorne is a gentleman." His letters were kind. "Kindness is cheap in ink," the woman retorted, turning her gaze back to the window. "It is expensive in person." The coach lurched violently as the wheels hit the rutted main street of Red Mesa. Lydia felt the impact in her teeth. She closed her eyes for a second, summoning the image of her mother's parlor in Boston, the cool velvet drapes, the ticking of the grandfather clock. That world was gone. Her father's debts had swallowed it whole, leaving Lydia with nothing but her reputation as a cold woman, a woman the doctors whispered about, and this desperate gamble in the West. The stagecoach ground to a halt in a cloud of choking red dust. Red Mesa was not a town. It was a scar on the landscape. A collection of rough-hewn timber buildings leaned against each other as if for support, lining a single muddy street that smelled of horse manure, unwashed bodies, and raw whiskey. To the west, the jagged silhouette of the mountains loomed like a fortress wall. To the east, the endless scrub brush stretched out toward the reservation lands. Lydia stepped down from the coach, her boots sinking into the dirt. The hem of her gray traveling dress was already stained reddish-brown. She shielded her eyes against the savage glare of the sun. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but the town was alive with a restless, predatory energy. Men loitered on the boardwalks, miners with coal dust in their beards, soldiers in dusty blue uniforms, and cowboys with eyes that tracked her movement like wolves tracking a fawn. They stopped their conversations to watch the new arrival. A mail-order bride was a curiosity. A mail-order bride who looked like a porcelain doll about to shatter was entertainment. Lydia gathered her courage. Lifting her chin, she had the directions in her pocket. The lawyer's office was next to the bank. "Boy," she called out to a scrawny lad leaning against a water trough. "Can you help me with this trunk?" The boy spat into the dirt and didn't move. "Cost you 2 bits. Lady—" Lydia hesitated. She had exactly $4.50 left in her purse. "Very well." She marched toward the lawyer's office, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. Mr. Thorne would be there. He would be older, perhaps a bit rough around the edges, but he would be solid. He would offer her his arm, and she would be safe. She would have a kitchen. She would have a door she could lock. She pushed open the door to the law office. A ceiling fan spun lazily, moving the hot air around without cooling it. Behind a cluttered desk sat a man who looked as though he had been dried out in the sun like beef jerky. "Mr. Henderson?" Lydia asked. "I am Lydia Barrett. I believe Mr. Thorne is expecting me." The lawyer looked up. He took off his spectacles and wiped them on his vest. He did not smile. He did not stand up. He looked at her with the weary expression of a man who delivered bad news for a living. "Miss Barrett," he said, his voice thin and scratchy. "You are early. The stage was not due until Friday." "I am here now," Lydia said, feeling a cold prickle of dread at the base of her neck. "Where is Mr. Thorne?" "Mr." Henderson sighed and opened a drawer, pulling out a file. He tossed it onto the desk. It landed with a sound of finality. "Elias Thorne is dead. Miss Barrett." The world tilted on its axis. The dusty office spun. Lydia grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. "Dead, but I have his letters. The contract. Shot in a dispute over a poker game at the saloon," Henderson said flatly. 2 weeks ago, he was holding a pair of jacks in a temper he could not control. "But," Lydia's voice was a whisper, "he paid for my passage. We have a contract. A contract with a corpse is void," Henderson said. He looked at her, not with sympathy, but with calculation. "He left nothing. Miss Barrett, the farm was mortgaged to the hilt. The bank took it this morning. His personal effects covered his burial and his bar tab. You are essentially a widow without the benefit of the inheritance." Lydia stared at him. The silence in the room was deafening. "I have nowhere to go," she said, the reality of it crashing down on her. "I have no money to return east," Henderson shrugged. "That is a common story out here. There are options for a woman of your appearance." He gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the rougher end of town. "Silas Crow at the Happy Jack Saloon is always looking for girls who can sing or entertain." The implication hit her like a physical blow. Lydia drew herself up, her face burning. "I am a teacher. I am a lady." "You are destitute in Red Mesa, Miss Barrett," Henderson said, putting his glasses back on. "Class distinctions tend to evaporate when the stomach is empty." Lydia turned and fled. She could not breathe in that office. She stumbled out onto the boardwalk, blinding sunlight assaulting her eyes. Dead. He was dead. The safety she had traveled 2,000 miles for had vanished in a puff of gun smoke. She stood paralyzed on the wooden planks, clutching her reticule. The heat was a physical weight. Across the street, the door to the saloon swung open, and the raucous sound of a piano spilled out. "Hey there, sweetheart," a voice drawled. A man with a thick beard and a shirt stained with sweat detached himself from a pillar and stepped into her path. "You look lost. You looking for a friend?" Lydia stepped back, her heel catching on a loose nail. "Please let me pass." "Don't be rude," the man sneered. Stepping closer, he smelled of sour mash and unwashed skin. "I heard old Henderson. Groom's dead. Eh? That makes you a free game." Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She looked around for a constable, a soldier, anyone. The people walking by averted their eyes. In Red Mesa, you minded your own business if you wanted to live. Then, the air in the street changed. It wasn't a sound, but a shift in pressure. The chatter on the boardwalks died down. The drunk man in front of her faltered, his eyes flicking over her shoulder. Lydia turned. Riding down the center of the main street was a group of 6 horsemen. They did not ride like the cowboys. Slouched and casual, they rode with spines like steel rods, moving in perfect rhythm with their mounts. Apache. Leading them was a man who commanded the very space he occupied. He rode a massive paint horse, its coat gleaming even under the layer of dust. He was not wearing the full regalia of a chief she had seen in the sensational drawings in the Eastern papers, but there was no mistaking his authority. He wore buckskin trousers and a simple calico shirt, but over it was a vest of dark leather adorned with intricate beadwork. His hair, black as a raven's wing, hung long and loose past his shoulders, held back by a strip of red cloth. But it was his face that stole the breath from her lungs. It was a harsh face, composed of sharp angles and copper skin, marked by a thin white scar that ran from his cheekbone to his jaw. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and utterly unreadable. Raven. The name whispered in the stagecoach. The chief who had signed a fragile peace treaty with the army. The man who walked the razor's edge between war and survival for his people. The townspeople watched him with a mixture of fear and hatred. But they stepped back. They gave him a wide berth. Lydia was frozen. She had never seen a native warrior this close. In Boston, they were monsters in stories. Here, he was undeniably, terrifyingly human. The drunk man, perhaps emboldened by the whiskey or perhaps just stupid, jeered. "Look at 'em, strutting around like they own the place. Hey, savage, why don't you go back to your rocks?" Raven did not even turn his head. He kept his horse moving at a steady walk, his gaze fixed forward toward the general store. The drunk, feeling ignored and insulted, grabbed a rock from the street and hurled it. It missed Raven but struck the flank of his horse. The horse reared, whinnying in protest. Chaos erupted in a heartbeat. The drunk stumbled back, colliding with Lydia. She was shoved hard. Her boot slipped off the edge of the high boardwalk. She flailed, her hands grasping at empty air, pitching forward into the dirt of the street, directly into the path of the rearing war horse. A scream tore from her throat, cut short as she hit the ground. Dust filled her mouth. She looked up, terrified, expecting to see iron hooves descending to crush her. But the hooves never came. With a terrifying grace, the rider had controlled the animal, swinging it aside with a subtle shift of his knees and a sharp command in a language she did not understand. Silence fell over the street. Lydia lay in the dirt, her hat askew, her dignity shattered. She pushed herself up on trembling arms. A pair of moccasined feet landed silently in the dust beside her. She looked up past the leather leggings, past the beaded vest, into the face of the Apache chief. Raven reached down. Lydia flinched, instinctively pulling back. The stories of scalping and torture flashed through her mind. He paused, his hand suspended in the air. It was a large hand, the skin rough and scarred, but the fingers were long and steady. He did not withdraw it. He simply waited, his dark eyes locking onto hers. In that gaze, Lydia did not see the bloodthirsty madness she had been warned about. She saw curiosity. She saw a stillness that unnerved her more than violence would have. He was looking at her not as a piece of meat and not as a nuisance, but as a question. Slowly, trembling, Lydia reached out. She placed her gloved hand in his. His grip was firm, pulling her to her feet with effortless strength. For a moment, they stood mere inches apart. She could smell him wood smoke, sage and leather. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered and lean. "Be careful where you step," he said. His voice was deep, resonant, and his English was startlingly clear, with only a slight, rhythmic cadence that marked it as foreign. Lydia was too stunned to speak. She stared at him, her mouth slightly open. "The ground here is unforgiving," he added, his eyes sweeping over her dusty dress, her pale, frightened face, and the locket resting at her throat. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. He nodded once, a curt, regal motion, then released her hand. He turned back to his horse, vaulting into the saddle in one fluid motion. He glanced at the drunk man, who was now cowering against a post. Raven said nothing, but the look he gave the man was enough to make the drunk wet himself. With a signal to his men, the Apache group moved on toward the general store. Lydia stood in the street, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. "You all right, miss?" A hand gripped her elbow, sharp and authoritative. Lydia spun around to find a man in a pristine blue uniform standing there. The captain's bars glinted on his shoulders. He was handsome in a severe, polished way, with blonde hair cropped close and a mustache that was waxed to perfection. "Captain Mercer," he introduced himself, steering her back onto the boardwalk as if she were a wayward child. "Commanding officer of Fort Defiance. I apologize for the disturbance. The savages are becoming increasingly bold." Lydia looked back toward where Raven had disappeared. He helped me." Mercer laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Do not mistake calculation for kindness. Miss Raven plays a game. He wants us to think he is civilized." Mercer looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her figure in a way that made Lydia want to cross her arms over her chest. "You must be the Barrett woman. Word travels fast. Thorne's intended—" "Yes," Lydia said, pulling her arm away from his grip. "A pity about Thorne," Mercer said, though he sounded bored. "And now you are here, alone, with no funds and no prospects." "I will find a way," Lydia said, lifting her chin. Though her voice shook, Mercer leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let me be frank. Miss Barrett, this town eats women like you. You have two choices. You can take the stage back east if you can beg the fare, or—" He glanced toward the brothel at the edge of town. "You can find a protector, but protectors come at a price." Lydia felt the bile rise in her throat. "I am not a whore, Captain." We all sell something, my dear," Mercer said coldly. "Labor, loyalty, or affection. I suggest you decide quickly what your currency will be, because by sunset, the wolves will come out, and they are not all Apache." He touched the brim of his hat and walked away, his boots clicking rhythmically on the wood. Lydia stood alone again. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, blood-red shadows across the street. She walked to the small, dingy hotel connected to the saloon, the only place she could afford for one night. The lobby smelled of stale beer. The innkeeper, a man with grease in his hair and a wandering eye, checked her in. "Room 4, he grunted, handing her a key. "Payment in advance." Lydia handed over 2 of her precious dollars. "You're the one meant for Thorne, ain't you?" the innkeeper asked, leaning over the counter. Lydia didn't answer, reaching for the key. "Heard about you," the man continued, lowering his voice. "Heard Thorne was complaining to the boys before he died. Said he got a discount on the contract 'cause the goods were damaged." He leered at her. "Said you were barren as a dry creek bed." "Is that true?" Lydia froze. The secret, the humiliation that had driven her from Philadelphia. The doctor had told her mother, and her mother had told her aunt. And somehow, it had ended up in the letter to Elias Thorne. A warning, a devaluation. "That is none of your business," Lydia snapped, snatching the key. "Just saying," the innkeeper chuckled. "Men out here want sons, a woman who can't breed. Well, she's just for fun, ain't she?" Lydia fled up the stairs, the laughter of the men in the saloon chasing her. She slammed the door to her small, stifling room and locked it. She dragged a chair under the doorknob. She sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She opened her locket. Her mother's face smiled back, gentle and oblivious. "I will have a home," Lydia whispered to the empty room. "I will not be broken." But outside, the sun had set. Through the thin walls, she could hear the drunken shouts of the miners. "I say we flip a coin for her!" a rough voice bellowed from the street below. "Thorne's dead! Finders keepers!" Laughter followed. Lydia blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. She moved to the window and peeked through the gap in the curtains, across the street, by the livery stable. The Apache were preparing to leave. They were loading sacks of flour and sugar onto pack horses. Raven stood apart from his men, adjusting the cinch on his saddle. As if he felt her gaze, he looked up, across the dust, across the cultural divide. His eyes found her window. He could not possibly see her in the dark. Yet Lydia felt seen. He stood there for a long moment, a statue of bronze and leather, the only stillness in a chaotic world. Then, he mounted his horse and turned toward the darkening desert. Lydia let the curtain fall back. She was trapped between the brutality of the men who claimed to be civilized and the unknown danger of the wild. Captain Mercer wanted to use her. The town wanted to consume her. She had to survive. She had to find a third option. The night air grew cold, but Lydia did not sleep. She sat in the dark, clutching her contract, listening to the boots on the boardwalk, waiting for the handle of her door to turn. The next morning, The reality of her situation had sharpened like a knife blade. Lydia counted her coins again. $2.50. Enough for food for a week, perhaps a room for one more night. And then she dressed with military precision, brushing the dust from her gray dress as best she could. She would go to the telegraph office. Perhaps there was a distant cousin, a charity, someone who would send a ticket home. It was a humiliating hope, but pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. As she walked toward the telegraph office, she noticed the tension in the town had ratcheted up. Soldiers were patrolling in pairs. Near the general store, a crowd had gathered. Captain Mercer was there, standing on a crate, his voice projecting over the murmurs of the townspeople. Beside him stood a man in a suit that cost more than Lydia's entire family home, had been worth Mr. Gideon Hale, the railroad speculator she had heard whispers about on the stagecoach. "Security of the territory," Mercer was saying. "The railroad is the artery of civilization, but we cannot lay tracks through land that is plagued by instability. The Apache have a treaty," a ragged farmer shouted from the back. "A treaty based on their good behavior." Mercer countered smoothly. "But can we trust savages to keep their word? We need to ensure that Red Mesa is safe for families, for commerce." Lydia skirted the edge of the crowd. She saw the way Mercer's eyes scanned the faces, looking for agreement, manipulating their fear. He wanted the land. The valley where the Apache lived was the only fertile stretch for 50 miles. Everyone knew it. She entered the general store, hoping to buy a biscuit and some cheese. Inside, the air was cooler. The smell of coffee beans and leather was comforting. But the conversation stopped when she entered. 3 men were leaning against the counter. One of them was drunk yesterday. "Well, looky here," he grinned, showing yellow teeth. "The Widow Thorne." Lydia ignored him, moving to the counter. "A 1/4 pound of cheese, please." The shopkeeper hesitated, glancing at the men. "I think," the drunk man said, stepping closer, "that you owe me an apology, Missy, for yesterday, getting that savage to nearly trample me." "I did no such thing," Lydia said, her voice trembling but clear. "You were intoxicated." Intoxicated," the man mocked her accent. "Listen to the fancy words. You think you're better than us? You ain't nothing but a rejected broodmare." He reached out and grabbed her wrist. "Let go," Lydia cried, dropping her purse. "You got no man to protect you," the drunk hissed, pulling her closer. The shopkeeper looked down at his ledger, refusing to intervene. "Which means you belong to the town." Suddenly, the door of the shop opened. A bell chimed, bright and innocent. "I believe," a deep voice said. "The lady asked for cheese." The drunk man froze. Raven stood in the doorway. He was alone this time. He had returned, perhaps for a forgotten supply, perhaps for reasons of his own. He filled the frame, the morning light silhouetting his broad shoulders. The drunk released Lydia's wrist as if it burned him. Raven stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under his moccasins. He did not look at the men. He walked to the counter, placed a coin on the wood, a silver dollar, and looked at the shopkeeper. "Cheese," Raven said. "For the lady." The shopkeeper scrambled to cut a wedge, wrapping it in brown paper with shaking hands. He slid it across the counter. Raven took it and turned to Lydia. He held it out. Lydia looked at the cheese, then at the man, up close. She saw the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the sheer weight of command he carried. "Why?" she whispered. "Because," Raven said quietly, "dignity is not a privilege of the white skin. It is a right of the human spirit." He placed the cheese in her hand. His fingers brushed hers, warm and rough. "Raven," Captain Mercer's voice boomed from the street. The captain stood in the doorway, hand resting on the hilt of his saber. 2 soldiers stood behind him, rifles ready. "You are disturbing the peace," Mercer said, his eyes cold. Raven turned slowly. "I am buying supplies, Captain, as the treaty allows." Your presence incites unrest," Mercer replied. "I suggest you return to your camp before an accident happens." Raven looked at Mercer, then at the drunk man, and finally at Lydia. A silent communication passed between them. He saw her fear, but also her resolve. She was not cowering behind him. She was standing her ground. "We are leaving," Raven said. He walked past Mercer, his shoulder brushing the captain's uniform. It was a deliberate, subtle insult. Mercer's face tightened. He watched the Apache leave, then turned his gaze to Lydia. "You are making dangerous friends. Miss Barrett," Mercer warned softly. "That savage cannot help you. He can only get you killed." Lydia clutched the package of cheese to her chest. She looked at the captain, then at the shopkeeper who had let her be assaulted, and finally at the door where Raven had exited. In a town of civilized men, only the savage had treated her with honor. She walked past Mercer, her head high. "I am learning, Captain," she said, "that the definition of savage is quite flexible in Red Mesa." She walked out into the blinding sun. She had eaten nothing since yesterday. She had no husband. She had no home. But as she walked down the dusty street, Lydia Barrett realized something. She was done being a victim. She was done waiting to be saved or sold. If she was going to survive in this hell, she would have to make a deal with the devil. She just had to decide which one. And the memory of a dark, scarred hand pulling her from the dust lingered in her mind. A strange and terrifying beacon of hope. The air in the dining room of the Red Mesa Hotel was thick enough to choke a man. It smelled of fried lard, stale beer, and the desperate perspiration of people trying to survive the unforgiving Arizona afternoon. Lydia Barrett sat at a small, wobbling table near the window, staring at a plate of biscuits she could barely afford and had no appetite to eat. She had $2.50 left in her purse, $2.50 to last her the rest of her life. The shadow fell over her table before she heard the boots. "Miss Barrett." Lydia looked up. Captain Mercer stood there, his hat tucked under his arm, his brass buttons gleaming with a mockery of order amidst the squalor. He pulled out the chair opposite her without asking permission and sat down. "Captain," Lydia said, her voice tight, "to what do I owe the honor?" Mercer placed his hands on the table. They were manicured hands, soft compared to the rough palms of the miners and cowboys. "I am a pragmatic man, Miss Barrett, and I hate to see a woman of your breeding in such distress. I've been reviewing your situation. My situation is temporary." Lydia lied. "Is it?" Mercer arched a brow. "Elias Thorne is on the ground. You have no funds. The next stagecoach east does not leave for 6 days, and the ticket costs $40. You do not have $40? Lydia went silent. He knew. Of course he knew. In a town this size, poverty was public knowledge. "I have a solution," Mercer said, leaning in. "There is a corporal in my regiment, Corporal Miller. He is a widower. He has 2 young children back in Ohio that he sends money to. But he needs a wife here, to manage his quarters, to comfort him." Lydia felt a cold shiver crawl down her spine. "I do not know Corporal Miller. He is a bit rough," Mercer admitted, shrugging. "He drinks when the nights are long, but he is a white man. He offers a roof. And frankly, Miss Barrett, for a woman with your particular medical reputation, beggars cannot be choosers." Lydia's face burned. The innkeeper. The innkeeper had told everyone. The rumor that she was barren, the very thing that had ruined her in Philadelphia, was now currency in Red Mesa. "I am not a piece of the livestock to be traded to your soldiers." "Captain," she hissed. "Aren't you?" A new voice cut in. Silas Crow, the owner of the Happy Jack Saloon and the brothel attached to it, stepped up to the table. He was a wide man, wearing a suit that was too tight and smelling of bay rum and cigars. "The captain offers you a hard life, darlin'," Crow said, his smile oily. "I offer you freedom. You have a pretty face, a very pretty face. I have rooms upstairs at the saloon, clean sheets, good food. My girls are protected. You sing a little, you dance a little, and you make the men feel like kings for an hour. You keep 50% of what you earn." Lydia looked from Mercer to Crow, the law and the lawless. Both of them looked at her with the same expression, predatory appraisal. I am a schoolteacher, Lydia said, her voice trembling. There are no schools here. Crow laughed. Only thirst and hunger. Make your choice. Miss Barrett, Mercer said, checking his pocket watch. Corporal Miller is expecting an answer by retreat at 6 o'clock. If you decline, and you cannot pay for this room tonight. He gestured to the street. The vagrancy laws are quite strict. She was trapped. The walls of the hotel seemed to be closing in on her. She looked around the room, hoping for a friendly face, but the other patrons, miners, and drifters kept their heads down. They knew better than to cross the army or the saloon boss. Outside, beyond the dusty window pane, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long, violent shadows across the street. Standing on the boardwalk, motionless as a statue, was Raven. He was not looking at the window, or so it seemed. He was speaking to a man Lydia recognized as Miguel, a Mexican scout who often translated for the army. Raven stood with his arms crossed, his face impassive, but his eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes, flickered toward the hotel door. Inside the dining room, Lydia stood up. Her legs felt weak. I need air, she said. I need a moment to think. You do not take too long, Mercer called after her as she hurried toward the door. Desperation has a way of making the decision for you. Lydia burst out onto the boardwalk, gasping for breath. The heat hit her like a physical blow, but it was better than the suffocating air inside. She leaned against a wooden post, closing her eyes, fighting back tears of sheer rage. The white man's law, a deep voice said nearby. It is a net. The more you struggle, the tighter it binds. Lydia opened her eyes. Raven was standing 10 feet away, near the hitching rail. Miguel stood beside him. The Apache chief was looking at her, not with pity, but with a strange intensity. They want to buy you, Raven said. It was a statement, not a question. Lydia wiped her eyes, straightening her spine. She would not break down in front of him. They think I have no value other than my body. Raven said something in his own tongue to Miguel. The language was guttural, but flowing, like water over rocks. Miguel nodded and turned to Lydia. He asks if you are truly the woman in the contract, the one who came to build a home. The contract is dead, Lydia said bitterly. Like Mr. Thorne. Raven stepped closer. The movement was silent, causing the wood of the boardwalk to barely creak. The man is dead. The need for a home is not... He looked past her, through the open door of the hotel where Mercer and Crow were now sharing a bottle of whiskey. Raven's jaw tightened. He had seen soldiers treat Apache women like cattle. He had seen them treat their own women a little better. Miguel, Raven said in English this time. Tell the captain I have a counteroffer. Lydia blinked. What? Raven did not answer her. He walked past her, pushing open the doors of the hotel. The saloon fell silent as the Apache chief walked in. Lydia followed, drawn by a force she could not name. Mercer looked up, annoyed. I thought I told you to return to your camp. Raven, I am here on business, Raven said. His voice carried to every corner of the room. Legal business. He pointed at Lydia, who was standing by the door, clutching her skirts. This woman, Raven said. She came to be a wife. She has a paper. A useless paper. Crow sneered. Not useless. Raven said. The law of the territory says a contract is a promise. If the man dies, the obligation remains to the estate, or to a new suitor who assumes the debt. Mercer laughed, leaning back in his chair. And who is the suitor, you? The room erupted in laughter. Even the drunk in the corner guffawed. An Apache marrying a white woman? It was absurd. It was unheard of. Raven did not smile. He waited for the laughter to die down, his silence suffocating the room until the men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Why not? Raven asked softly. I have signed your treaty. I have stopped the raids. I am raising cattle, as your government demanded. I am building a house of wood, as your agent instructed. You say you want us to be civilized. You say you want us to settle. He took a step toward Mercer. What is more civilized than a marriage? A legal marriage, sanctioned by your church and your law. Mercer stopped laughing. He sat up slowly, his eyes narrowing. He was a cruel man, but he was not a stupid one. He looked at Raven, standing proud and defiant. Then he looked at Lydia, pale and trembling by the door. If Raven took the white woman, he would be tied down. He would be trying to prove a point. And if the woman disappeared out there in the canyons, if she died of hardship or ran away, Mercer could use it. He could claim the Apache had killed her. He could tear up the treaty and take the valley for the railroad. It was a gamble. But it was a gamble with high rewards. "You are serious," Mercer said. "I do not joke about family," Raven replied. Mercer stood up, brushing crumbs from his uniform. He walked over to Lydia. The smell of his cologne was cloying. "Well, Miss Barrett," Mercer said, his voice dripping with false concern. "It seems you have a third suitor, a savage who wants to play house." He gestured around the room. "Corporal Miller in the barracks." Mercer listed, pointing west. "Silas Crow and the brothel." He pointed to the bar. "Or him." He pointed at Raven. "Be aware," Mercer whispered in her ear, loud enough for Raven to hear. "He is a heathen. You will be living in dirt. You will be an outcast to your own race. No white door will ever open for you again." Lydia looked at the three men. Corporal Miller represented servitude. Silas Crow represented degradation. And Raven. She looked at the Apache chief. He was watching her. He was not looking at her body. He was looking at her hands, her eyes. He was offering a transaction. Yes, but there was dignity in it. He was challenging the room, challenging the captain, on her behalf. Lydia's voice failed her. "I will not be a whore," she said, her voice gaining strength. She looked at Crow. "And I will not be a slave to a soldier who needs a housekeeper he can beat." She turned to Raven. "You offer marriage, a true marriage. I offer a home," Raven said, "and protection, and the name of my people." "Miss Barrett," Mercer warned. "Think carefully." "I have thought," Lydia said. She felt a strange calm settle over her. The calm of someone who jumps off a cliff because the woods behind them are on fire. "I choose him." The silence in the room was absolute. "Very well," Mercer said, his face twisting into a sneer. "If you want to breed with the animals, that is your choice. But do not come crawling back to the fort when the winter comes." He turned to the innkeeper. "Get the justice of the peace. We will do this now. I want it on paper before she comes to her senses." "Not here," Raven said abruptly. He walked over to Lydia. "Outside. The air here is bad." He did not touch her, but he gestured for her to follow. Lydia walked out of the hotel, leaving the shocked whispers of the townspeople behind her. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of purple and bruised orange. The heat was finally breaking. Raven led her away from the boardwalk, toward the edge of town where the desert began. He stopped near a large ironwood tree. "Why?" Lydia asked, hugging her arms around herself. "Why did you do that? You do not know me." "I know that you are alone," Raven said. "And I know that men like Mercer will eat you alive." He turned to face her. The dying light caught the sharp angles of his face, the white scar on his cheek standing out like a line of chalk. "My people are on a narrow path. Lydia," he said, using her name for the first time. It sounded strange and heavy on his tongue. "The soldiers wait for us to fall. They say we are wild dogs. They want our land for the Iron Road. If I take a white wife, if we live in peace, if we build a family, it is a shield. It makes it harder for them to kill us in the dark." He was honest. It was a political alliance. Lydia appreciated that. He was not lying to her with pretty words about romance. "But there is something you must know," Lydia said. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment. If she told him, he would retract the offer. He would leave her here, and she would have to go to Silas Crow. But she could not start this life with a lie, not with him. "They call me the Barren Bride," Lydia said, her voice barely a whisper. "That is why Mr. Thorne could buy my contract so cheaply. The doctors in the East, they said I have a condition. I likely cannot bear children." She looked down at her boots. waiting for his anger, waiting for him to walk away. In the West, a wife was valuable for two things: labor and sons. If she could not give sons, she was half a wife. "Look at me," Raven commanded. Lydia slowly raised her head. Raven's expression had not changed. There was no disgust. There was only a deep, ancient sorrow that mirrored the landscape around them. "I had two brothers," Raven said softly. "Killed by the Bluecoats 3 winters ago. I had a wife. Once, before the treaty. She died of the coughing sickness the white men brought. Her baby died with her." Lydia gasped softly. "Death is a frequent visitor to my Hogan," Raven continued. "I have lost much. I want to rebuild. I want life to fill the valley again." He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "I do not ask for a guarantee of flesh," Raven said. "I know that spirits give and spirits take away." He looked deep into her eyes, searching for something far more important than biology. "I ask you this," he said, his voice low and intense. "Will you try? Will you give me sons or daughters if the spirits allow it? Will you raise them well? Will you teach them to be strong, to walk in two worlds, to not be afraid of the wind?" Lydia stared at him. He was not asking for her body. He was asking for her courage. He was asking for her partnership. Lydia choked back a sob. "I will try. If God allows it, I will give you children. And if he does not, I will love whatever family we find." "That is enough," Raven said. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small knife. For a second, Lydia flinched, but he only cut a small lock of hair from his own head. He held it out to her. "In my custom, this is a promise," he said. "The paper the white man signs is for him. This is for us." Lydia took the lock of black hair. Her hand brushed his. "I accept," she whispered. 10 minutes later, the justice of the peace, a man who smelled of onions and sweat, stood on the porch of the hotel. Mercer stood by as a witness, a smirk playing on his lips as he signed the document. "Lydia Barrett," the justice mumbled, "do you take this man, Raven, to be your lawful husband?" "I do," Lydia said. "And you?" The justice looked at Raven with distaste. "Yes," Raven said. "Sign here." Lydia signed her name. Her hand did not shake. Raven signed with an X, though Lydia suspected he could write if he chose to. Mercer snatched the paper up, blowing on the ink. "Done. You are now the problem of the Apache Nation. Mrs. Raven." He mocked the lack of a surname. "I will file this with the territory office. It will be very useful when we need to determine property lines." Raven ignored him. He whistled, and Miguel brought the horses around. He mounted his paint horse with fluid grace, then extended a hand down to Lydia, for the second time in 2 days. Lydia took his hand. He pulled her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist. The leather of his vest was warm. He smelled of sage and smoke. "Hold on," Raven said. He kicked the horse into a trot. "Lydia Barrett, no. Lydia of the Valley rode out of Red Mesa. She did not look back at the hotel, or the saloon, or Captain Mercer standing on the boardwalk with his self-satisfied smile. She pressed her face against Raven's back. They were leaving civilization, or so the map said. But as they crossed the boundary into the dark desert, leaving the cruelty of the town behind, Lydia wondered if for the first time in her life, she was actually riding towards something civilized. Ahead of them, the moon rose over the jagged peaks, illuminating the path to a home she had never seen, with a husband she barely knew, carrying a hope she had thought dead. The inciting incident was over. The journey had begun. The transition from the harsh, sun-baked scrubland of the high desert to the Apache stronghold was so abrupt that Lydia felt as though she had crossed an invisible threshold between two different worlds. For hours, she had clung to Raven's waist, her body aching from the unfamiliar rhythm of the horse, her eyes stinging from the alkali dust. But as the horses picked their way through a narrow, twisting canyon where the red rock walls rose high enough to blot out the sky, the air suddenly changed. It grew cooler. sweeter, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth. They emerged from the canyon into a sprawling valley that looked like a bowl of emerald green cupped in the hands of the mountains. A creek, swollen with snowmelt from the higher peaks, cut a silver ribbon through the center of the grass. Cottonwood trees shimmered in the wind, their leaves turning gold and green. Scattered along the banks were clusters of dwellings. Some were traditional wickiups, rounded frames covered in brush and hides, while others were simple log structures, evidence of the tribe's attempt to adapt to the government's demands for permanence. Smoke curled lazily from cooking fires. Children ran through the tall grass, their laughter ringing like bells in the clear air. Women were gathered near the stream, scraping hides or grinding corn. It was not the chaotic, savage war camp the Eastern newspapers had described, filled with bloodthirsty marauders sharpening their knives. It was a village. It was a community breathing in the rhythm of the late afternoon. As the hunting party rode in, a hush fell over the valley. The laughter of the children died away. The women stopped their work, their hands freezing in mid-motion. Lydia felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes settling on her. She straightened her spine, refusing to cower behind Raven's back, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. To these people, she was the enemy. She was the face of the soldiers who burned their winter stores, the face of the politicians who broke treaties before the ink was dry. Raven slowed his horse to a walk, guiding the animal through the center of the camp. He did not look left or right, but Lydia saw the subtle nods of acknowledgement he gave to the warriors who stood guard by the lodges. A group of women approached, led by an elderly matron whose face was a map of deep wrinkles and weathered skin. Her gray hair was braided with strips of colored cloth, and her eyes were black, sharp and unyielding. This was Nayeli, the matriarch whose approval carried as much weight as the chief's command. Raven halted his horse and slid to the ground. He reached up, offering a hand to Lydia. She took it, her legs trembling as they hit the earth. She felt unsteady, dusty, and acutely aware of her gray woolen dress, which was stiff with sweat and grime. Nayeli stepped forward, stopping inches from Lydia. The old woman did not speak. She simply looked. Her gaze traveled from the top of Lydia's pinned-up bonnet down to her scuffed boots. She looked at Lydia's hands, soft and unaccustomed to labor, and then at her hips, narrow and, in the eyes of the world, useless. "She is thin," Nayeli said in English, her voice sounding like dry leaves scraping over stone. "She will break in the first winter storm." Raven spoke to her in their own tongue, his tone respectful but firm. Lydia caught the cadence of authority. He was explaining, perhaps justifying. Nayeli listened, her expression unchanging. Then she looked at Lydia again. "You are the White Wife," she said. It was not a greeting. It was a label. "Raven says you are to be treated as one of us. We shall see if you can survive being one of us." She turned and barked a command to the younger women, who dispersed, though they continued to cast covert glances at the stranger in their midst. Raven touched Lydia's elbow, guiding her toward a small, solitary structure made of pine logs and canvas, situated slightly apart from the main cluster of homes, but close to his own larger dwelling. "This is your place," Raven said. He pulled back the heavy blanket that served as a door. Inside, it was simple. A fire pit in the center, a bed of furs raised off the ground on a frame of willow branches, and a few clay pots. It was clean, smelling of sage and cedar. "You will sleep here," Raven said, standing at the entrance. He did not step inside. Lydia turned to him, clutching her satchel. The reality of her marriage, this strange, desperate bargain, hung between them. "And you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I sleep in the lodge of the chief," Raven said, nodding toward the larger structure. "I told you, Lydia. I am a man of my word. I offered you protection and a name. I did not buy a concubine." He looked at her with that intense, unreadable gaze. "You are my wife by law. That keeps the soldiers away. But in this valley, respect is earned, not signed on paper. I will not share your furs until you invite me. and I will not expect an invitation until you understand what it means to be in this place." He pointed toward the stream where the women were working. "Tomorrow, your education begins. You cannot be a guest here. Guests are burdens. If you stay, you work." Lydia nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I am not afraid of work." "Raven." "Good," he said, "because the work here is hard, and the mountains do not care if you are tired." The next 2 weeks were a blur of exhaustion and humiliation that tested Lydia's resolve more than any finishing school in Philadelphia ever had. She quickly learned that she knew absolutely nothing about survival. In the East, meat came from the butcher, wrapped in paper. Here, meat came with skin, blood, and sinew attached, and it was the woman's job to turn it into something usable. Her first attempt at scraping a deer hide was a disaster. The smell of the raw skin made her stomach heave violently, forcing her to run to the bushes to retch while the younger Apache women giggled behind their hands. The scraping tool slipped from her slick, blistered fingers, gouging a hole in the hide. Nayeli was there in an instant, snatching the tool away. "You ruin it," she scolded, her eyes flashing. "An animal died from this. You waste its life with your clumsiness." Lydia wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, her eyes watering. "Show me again," she rasped. "Please, show me how to hold it." Nayeli paused, surprised by the lack of tears or defiance. She grunted, then slowed her movements, demonstrating the angle of the blade. Lydia tried again, and again. By sunset, her arms felt like lead, and she smelled of death and copper, but the hide was scraped. Cooking was no easier. She burned the flatbread on the hot stones because she was distracted by the smoke in her eyes. She dropped a clay pot of water she had hauled from the creek, shattering it and soaking her skirts. Yet, she did not retreat to her lodge to weep. She ate the burnt bread. She picked up the shards of pottery. She watched the women, mimicking their movements, learning the rhythm of their labor. She learned that dried buffalo dung burned hotter and cleaner than green wood. She learned which berries were sweet and which would stop the bowels. Raven watched her from a distance. He rarely interfered. He spent his days with the men, checking the herd of cattle the government insisted they raise, or meeting with the scouts who patrolled the borders of their land. But in the evenings, when Lydia sat by her small fire, too tired to move, she would often find a fresh water skin or a portion of cooked venison left near her door. One afternoon, the heat was sweltering. Lydia had walked to the far ridge to gather kindling, seeking the dried scrub oak that grew among the rocks. She was nearly a mile from the main camp, enjoying the solitude and the vast view of the Red Canyon below. She heard the slide of gravel before she saw them. 3 men scrambled up the slope from a hidden trail that led toward Red Mesa. They were white men, dusty and unshaven, smelling of stale whiskey even at this distance. They were not soldiers, but drift miners, the kind of men who looked at the Apache land and saw only gold veins they were forbidden to touch. Lydia froze, clutching her bundle of sticks. "Well, look at this," one of the men slurred, wiping sweat from his forehead with a dirty sleeve. "A little white dove lost in the buzzard's nest." Lydia backed away, her heart slamming against her ribs. "I am not lost," she said, channeling the coldest tone of a Philadelphia schoolteacher. "I am Lydia Barrett, wife of Chief Raven. You are trespassing." The men laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Wife," the second man sneered. "You mean his pet. Heard about you in town, the barren bride who likes the redskins." They fanned out, moving to cut off her path back to the valley. "You know," the third man said, unbuckling his belt with a leer that made Lydia's blood run cold. "It ain't right, a white woman serving a savage. Maybe we should remind you what a real man feels like." Lydia dropped the wood and reached for the small knife Raven had given her, the one for cutting herbs. It was pitifully small against 3 men, but she raised it, her hand shaking. "Stay back," she warned. They lunged. Lydia slashed out, catching the first man on the arm, but the second man tackled her. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. She hit the hard ground, the taste of dust filling her mouth. Rough hands grabbed at her skirts. She screamed, scratching and kicking, fighting with the ferocity of a trapped animal. Then, the weight was suddenly gone. There was a sickening crunch of bone meeting bone. Lydia gasped, scrambling backward. Raven stood over her. He had appeared as silently as a shadow. He held his war club, a heavy stone bound to a wooden handle in one hand. The man who had tackled her was on the ground, clutching a shattered jaw, moaning in agony. The other two men stumbled back, reaching for the pistols at their waists. Raven moved faster than thought. He swung the club again, not to kill, but to disarm. He struck the wrist of the second man, sending the gun spinning away into the brush. He kicked the third man in the kneecap, dropping him to the dirt with a howl of pain. In 10 seconds, the fight was over. Raven stood amidst the groaning men, his chest heaving slightly. His eyes were black holes of fury. He raised the club high, ready to bring it down on the skull of the man who had touched Lydia. "Raven!" Lydia screamed. "No!" The club froze in the air. "They touched you!" Raven snarled, his voice a guttural growl. "They forfeit their lives." "If you kill them," Lydia cried, scrambling to her feet and grabbing his arm. "The army will come. Mercer will use it. He will say you murdered unarmed prospectors. Please, do not give them the excuse." Raven looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, but also the logic. He lowered the club slowly. The rage in his muscles vibrated under her hand. He turned to the men, who were now cowering in the dirt, bleeding and broken. "Go," Raven said, his voice cold as the grave. "Crawl back to Red Mesa. Tell the others that the next time I find filth on my land, I will not listen to my wife. I will leave your heads on spikes for the vultures." The men did not need to be told twice. They scrambled down the slope, dragging their injured comrade, disappearing into the canyon. Raven turned to Lydia. He dropped the club and took her shoulders in his hands. His grip was hard, almost painful. "Did they hurt you?" "No," Lydia whispered, shaking. "Just bruises." He pulled her against him. It was the first time he had truly held her since the wedding. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. She could feel his heart beating against hers, a frantic, thunderous rhythm. "I should have killed them," he muttered into her hair. "For touching you. You showed mercy," Lydia said, resting her head against his leather vest. "That takes more strength." "It is not mercy," Raven said, pulling back to look at her. "It is a strategy. You're right. Mercer waits for one drop of white blood to wash this valley away. 30 miles away, in the polished office of the commander at Fort Defiance. Captain Mercer poured a glass of expensive brandy for his guest. Gideon Hale sat in a leather armchair, looking entirely out of place in the dusty fort. He wore a suit of fine gray wool and smoked a cigar that smelled of money. Hale was a man who built railroads, and he looked at the world not as a landscape, but as a grid of potential profit. "The survey reports are conclusive." "Captain," Hale said, tapping a rolled-up map on the desk, "the southern pass is too steep. The locomotives cannot make the grade. The only viable route for the transcontinental line is through the Serenity Valley." "Raven's Valley," Mercer said, taking a sip of his drink. "Precisely." Hale nodded. "The treaty grants them that land in perpetuity, as long as they remain peaceful." "They are peaceful," Mercer said with a sneer. "Raven is disciplined. He has his warriors herding cattle like cowboys, and now he has this bride." Hale laughed softly. "Yes, the Barrett woman. A brilliant move on his part. A white wife makes him look civilized to the politicians in Washington. It makes it harder to justify eviction." "It is a farce," Mercer snapped. "She is a desperate spinster playing house with a savage." "Then we must prove it is a farce," Hale said, his eyes narrowing. "Or better yet, a crime. If the public believes she is being held against her will, or that the marriage is a sham designed to defraud the government, well, public outrage is a powerful tool. It can tear up treaties faster than any cannon." Mercer smiled, a thin, cruel curving of his lips. "I have a report from some prospectors. They claim they were attacked by Raven near the ridge. Unprovoked." "Excellent," Hale said. And the woman, is she suffering? We will ensure that she is, Mercer said. I will send a formal inquiry. We will demand to inspect her welfare. And if she refuses to leave, we will save her from herself. That night, the air in the valley was cool and still. The tribe gathered around a large central fire. The drums began a low, steady beat, mimicking the pulse of the earth. Lydia sat on a buffalo robe near the edge of the circle. She was still shaken from the attack, her shoulder aching where she had hit the ground. Raven sat beside her, closer than usual. The children were asleep. The elders were singing a song that sounded mournful and low. What are they singing? Lydia asked softly. It is a song for those who walked the path before us. Raven answered. He picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending sparks swirling into the black sky. It says that the dead are not gone. They are in the wind that moves the grass. He looked at her, the firelight casting deep shadows across his face. Today, when those men came, I was afraid. Lydia looked at him in surprise. You afraid? I have seen many battles, Raven said. I have taken scalps and I have lost friends, but when I saw them... He stopped, his hand clenching the stick until it snapped. My brother, Coda, he died protecting his wife from soldiers. They shot him, and then they took her. She took her own life 2 days later. I could not save them. Lydia reached out, covering his large hand with her own. His skin was rough, scarred, but warm. I am sorry, she whispered. I swore I would never let that happen again, Raven said. That is why I fight so hard for peace, why I swallow my pride when Mercer insults me, because war means losing everything. Lydia looked into the fire. I know what it is to be defined by loss, she said. In Philadelphia, I was not a person. I was a broken vessel, because I could not carry a child. My fiancé looked at me as if I were a horse with a broken leg, something to be put down or sold cheap. She turned to Raven. You asked me to give you sons, but you must know, the doctors said it is unlikely. I am defective. Raven turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. The gesture was intimate, shocking in its tenderness. A vessel is only broken if it cannot hold what is poured into it, Raven said quietly. You hold courage. You hold loyalty. I saw you today. You stood with a small knife against 3 men. You did not run. You fought for this place. He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. My brother left no sons, but his memory lives because we speak his name. Blood is strong, Lydia, but spirit is stronger. If you never carry a babe in your womb, you are still a mother to this valley if you help us survive. Lydia felt a tear trace a path down her dusty cheek. For the first time in years, the knot of shame in her chest loosened. She was not a barren bride here. She was a warrior's partner. I will help you, she vowed. I will not let Mercer take this. I will not let Hale take this. They sat in silence for a long time, the bond between them solidifying in the quiet dark. It was not yet love. Love was a luxury they had not yet earned, but it was a profound, unshakable alliance. Later, as the fire burned down to embers, Lydia stood to return to her lodge. Naili emerged from the shadows. The old woman had been watching them. She blocked Lydia's path. Lydia braced herself for a scolding about the incident on the ridge. Naili looked at Lydia's hand, which was still tingling from Raven's touch. He looks at you with soft eyes, Naili said. Her voice was low, stripped of its usual harshness but heavy with warning. He sees a woman, but you must remember, White Daughter, he is the pillar that holds up the sky for us. If you lean on him too hard, or if you run away and let him fall, the sky crushes all of us. I am not running, Lydia said firmly. Naili studied her face, searching for the lie. She did not find one. Good, Naili grunted. She reached into her pouch and pulled out a small jar of salve. For your bruises, bear grease and arnica. It smells bad, but it heals. She shoved the jar into Lydia's hand and turned away. Lydia stood alone in the dark. holding the smelly jar like a precious jewel. She looked toward Raven's lodge, where a single light still burned. Then she looked up at the stars, sharp and bright over the jagged silhouette of the mountains. She was an outcast. She was in danger. She was married to a man the world called a savage. But as she walked back to her small wickiup, Lydia realized she was breathing deeper than she ever had in the parlor rooms of Boston. She was beginning to understand the price of this freedom, and she was terrified to find that she was willing to pay it. The change in the seasons brought a subtle shift in the valley, not just in the color of the leaves along the creek, which turned to burnished gold, but in the way the people looked at Lydia. She was no longer the ghost woman who stumbled over roots and burned the bread. She was the woman who had stood against the intruders. She was the woman who carried water until her hands blistered and then carried more. One evening, as the sun dipped below the canyon walls, painting the sky in violent streaks of violet and orange, Niley came to Lydia's wake. Behind her trailed 3 younger women and a gaggle of children. "Come," Niley said, her voice gruff but lacking its former edge. "It is time." Lydia wiped her hands on her apron and followed them to the central circle. A fire crackled there, distinct from the cooking fires. It was a small gathering, intimate. The woman presented her with a blanket. It was heavy wool, woven with intricate patterns of red, black, and white, the colors of earth, night, and bone. "This keeps the wind out," a young woman named Sani said shyly in English. "It keeps the warmth in." Then the children came forward. A little girl, no older than 5, dipped her hand into a bowl of wet clay and pressed it onto a flat river stone near the fire. She pointed to Lydia and giggled, saying a word that sounded like tu. "It means water." Raven's voice came from behind her. Lydia turned. He was standing there, watching the scene with a softness in his eyes she rarely saw. "They call you water," Raven explained, "because you are quiet, but you cut through the rock eventually." He stepped forward into the light of the fire. In his hand, he held an object wrapped in soft deerskin. He unwrapped it slowly to reveal a knife. It was not a weapon of war like the heavy blade he carried at his hip. This was a tool of daily life, the handle carved from smooth elk antler, inlaid with small turquoise stones. "In my tribe," Raven said, his voice carrying clearly in the silence, "a woman is not a possession. She is the keeper of the fire. She prepares what the hunters bring. Without her knife, the deer is useless. Without her hand, the family starves." He held the knife out to her. "Handle first. Take this," he said. "It means I trust you with my life. It means you are no longer a guest who eats, but a wife who provides." Lydia took the knife. It felt heavy and balanced in her hand. She looked around the circle at Nayeli, at Sani, at the children with their clay-stained hands. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she did not feel like a piece of damaged goods. She felt essential. "Thank you," she whispered. 2 nights later, the autumn rains arrived. It was not the gentle drizzle of the East Coast, but a sudden, torrential downpour that hammered the earth, turning the dry creek beds into roaring torrents. The temperature plummeted. Inside her wickiup, Lydia shivered. The fire in the center pit hissed as drops of water found their way through the smoke hole. She pulled her new blanket tighter around her shoulders, but the damp cold seemed to seep into her very bones. The flap of the entrance lifted. Raven ducked inside. He was dripping wet, his hair plastered to his neck, his buckskin shirt dark with rain. He carried a large buffalo robe in his arms. "The storm is bad," he said, his voice low. "The wind is coming from the north." He moved to the fire, shaking the water from his hair like a wolf. He looked at her, huddled in her blanket. "You are cold," he stated. "I am fine," Lydia lied, her teeth chattering. Raven did not argue. He unfolded the buffalo robe. It was massive, thick and smelling of smoke and earth. He did not hand it to her. Instead, he moved to her sleeping platform and spread it over her existing blankets. Then, he sat down on the edge of the furs. The space in the wickiup was small. His presence filled it completely. Lydia could smell the rain on his skin, the scent of wet leather and sage. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He looked at her, the firelight dancing in his dark eyes. "It has been 3 months, Lydia," he said softly. "Yes," she breathed. "You have learned to scrape the hide. You have learned to find the water. You have stood against the wolves." He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His touch was calloused, but incredibly gentle. "You are not a guest anymore." Lydia looked at him. The fear that had defined her relationship with men, the fear of being judged, found wanting, and discarded, was strangely absent. In its place was a thrumming awareness, a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. "I do not want to be a guest," she whispered. Raven shifted, turning his body toward her. His face was serious, but the harsh lines around his mouth had softened. "Do you remember what I asked you that first day?" Lydia nodded. "You asked if I would give you sons. I asked if you would try." Raven corrected her. "I asked for your will, not your guarantee." He took her hand, interlacing his fingers with hers. The contrast between his dark, scarred skin and her pale hand was stark. Yet they fitted together perfectly. "We are 2 people who have lost much," he said, his voice dropping to a murmur that blended with the drumming of the rain. "But tonight, we are alive. I do not want just to survive. Lydia, I want to plant seeds. I want a future." He leaned closer, his gaze searching hers. "Will you give me sons, and will you give me daughters who will ride the wind and not be afraid of the thunder? Will you build this life with me?" Lydia looked at the man who had saved her when her own world had thrown her away. She saw the loneliness behind his strength, the hope behind his stoicism. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I will give you everything I have. I will give you sons or daughters, or just my heart if that is all God allows." Raven closed the distance between them. He lowered his head, his lips brushing hers tentatively at first. A question asked in the dark. Lydia did not pull away. She leaned into him, her hands rising to touch the damp hair at the nape of his neck. The kiss deepened. It was not the polite, dry affection she had expected from Elias Thorne. It was raw and honest, tasting of rain and longing. Raven's arms went around her, pulling her against his chest, crushing the air from her lungs in the most beautiful way. The storm raged outside, the wind howling against the canvas walls, but inside, there was only the fire and the warmth of 2 broken people fitting their jagged edges together to make something whole. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic in the valley changed. Lydia and Raven were no longer 2 wary allies circling each other. They were a unit. It was in the small things. When Raven returned from checking the herd, his eyes sought Lydia first. When they sat by the fire in the evening, his hand would rest on the small of her back, a silent claim of protection and affection. He taught her to ride not like a lady in a park, but like an Apache. "Do not fight the horse," he instructed, his hands on her waist as he adjusted her seat. "Move with him. Be like water." She fell off 3 times. Each time, Raven was there to dust her off, not with mockery, but with a quiet pride in her determination to get back on. In return, Lydia brought the softness of her past into their rough life. She found a way to grind the corn finer, mixing it with the precious sack of white flour she had traded for in town. She made biscuits in a Dutch oven over the coals. "It is dense," Raven noted, chewing thoughtfully on her first attempt. "It is a biscuit," Lydia laughed, throwing a piece of dry grass at him. "It is supposed to be dense." He laughed, then a deep, rumbling sound that made the other warriors look up in surprise. It was a sound that had been missing from the valley for too long. Then, the change happened. It started with a dizziness that seized Lydia one morning as she bent to fill a water jug. The world spun, and she had to sit down on the damp grass until the nausea passed. Then came the lateness. She counted the days on the calendar she kept in her mind. 5 days late, 10 days. Her heart leaped into her throat. Could it be? After the doctors in Philadelphia had shaken their heads with such certainty, after the shame that had driven her west, she dared not speak of it. It was too fragile a hope, like a soap bubble that would burst if she breathed on it. But every time she looked at Raven, playing with the orphan children of the tribe, lifting them onto his shoulders, her hand would drift unconsciously to her stomach. Perhaps the spirits of this valley were kinder than the god of the stone churches back east. While hope bloomed in the valley, poison was brewing in Red Mesa. Captain Mercer sat in his office, the air thick with cigar smoke. Gideon Hale paced the floor, his boots clicking on the wood. Seated in the corner was a man who wore the collar of a reverend, though his eyes were shifting and bloodshot. This was Reverend Thomas, a man whose faith was as flexible as his need for whiskey. "The narrative is simple," Mercer said, leaning back in his chair. "We cannot simply evict them. The treaty holds. We need a moral imperative." "The woman," Hale said, swirling his brandy. "Mrs. Barrett. She is not Mrs. Barrett anymore." Mercer sneered. "She is playing squaw." "Exactly." Hale smiled thinly. "And no white Christian woman would do that voluntarily, not unless she was coerced, brainwashed, or living in fear for her life." He turned to the Reverend. "You spoke with her when she first arrived, did you not?" "Thomas. Briefly," the Reverend mumbled. "She asked for directions to the lawyer." "No," Hale corrected him smoothly. "She came to you in distress. She confided in you that she was terrified. She told you that she was being pursued by savages, and then she vanished." The Reverend blinked, licking his dry lips. "I suppose memory can be a tricky thing." Hale placed a gold coin on the table. It glinted in the lamplight. "Memory is often improved by charity, Reverend." Mercer nodded. "We drafted the affidavit today. The captivity of Lydia Barrett. We claim she is being held against her will, suffering under the heathen yoke. We petitioned the governor for a rescue mission." "And if she denies it?" Thomas asked. "She is a woman alone in a savage land." Mercer said coldly. "Stockholm Syndrome is a recognized condition. She does not know she needs saving. But we will save her, and in the process, we will find Raven in violation of the treaty. We will remove the tribe for their own protection and hers." Mercer looked at the map on the wall, at the green valley marked Reservation. "Prepare the men," Mercer said. "We ride as soon as the snow melts." The morning the pain started. The sky was a brilliant, heartless blue. Lydia was helping Sani carry wood for the smoking rack. It was not a heavy load, but as she lifted the bundle, a sharp, tearing pain ripped through her lower abdomen. She gasped, dropping the wood. "Lydia?" Sani asked, turning around. "It is nothing," Lydia gasped, clutching her stomach. "Just a cramp." But it was not a cramp. It was a twisting, grinding agony that doubled her over. And then she felt the warmth, the terrifying wet warmth sliding down her legs. "No," she whispered. "Please, no." She stumbled toward her wickiup, ignoring Sani's frightened questions. She needed to hide. She needed to stop this. Inside the dim shelter, she checked. The blood was bright red. Too much blood. Lydia curled into a ball on her furs, biting her fist to stifle the screams that clawed at her throat. The hope that had sustained her for weeks was draining away with the blood. The doctors were right. The innkeeper was right. She was broken. She was a barren field where nothing could grow. She lay there for hours, shivering as the pain came in waves and then subsided into a dull, hollow ache. She heard footsteps outside, Raven's voice calling her name, cheerful and expectant. He had returned from the hunt. "Lydia, I have brought a turkey. We can—" He pushed open the flap. He stopped. The metallic scent of blood filled the small space. He saw her curled form, the pale face streaked with tears and sweat, the stained blankets. Raven dropped the turkey. He was at her side in a heartbeat. "Lydia," he said, his voice laced with panic. "Are you hurt? Did someone—" "I lost it," Lydia choked out, turning her face away from him. "I am sorry. I am so sorry. I lost it." Raven froze. He looked at the blood, then at her stomach. An understanding dawned in his eyes. The pain on his face was immediate and sharp, but it was not anger. "A baby," he whispered. "I told you," Lydia sobbed, her body shaking with grief. I told you I was defective. I cannot give you what you want. You should send me away. You should find a wife who is whole." She tried to pull away from him, terrified of seeing disgusted disappointment in his eyes. Raven did not pull away. He grabbed a basin of water and a clean cloth. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he began to wipe her face. Then her hands. "Hush," he commanded gently. "Do not speak such words." "It is true," Lydia cried. "I failed you." Raven threw the cloth down. He gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were swimming with unshed tears, but his gaze was fierce. "You think I married you for a broodmare?" he demanded, his voice rough. "You think my love is a trade, a baby for a home? That is the way of the world." Lydia wept. "Not my world," Raven said. "Not our world." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, rocking her as she wept. "I have buried brothers," he whispered into her hair. "I have buried my wife. I have buried children who never took a breath. Death is part of this land. It takes, but it does not define us." He pulled back, framing her face in his large hands. "Listen to me, Lydia. The spirits give, and they take. Perhaps a child will come, perhaps not. But look at me." He waited until her tear-filled eyes met his. "You are enough. You, the woman who fights with a knife, the woman who bakes stones and calls them biscuits, the woman who holds my heart in her hands. You are enough." Lydia looked at him, searching for the lie, for the hidden resentment. She found only a fierce, protective love. "But the tribe," she whispered. "You need heirs." "The tribe needs a mother," Raven said. "There are many children here with no parents. Children who lost their fathers to the soldiers, their mothers to the sickness. If our blood does not make a child, our hearts will adopt them. We will fill this house with children who need us, not just children we created." He kissed her forehead, then her wet cheeks. "We grieve today," he said firmly. "We cry for the little one who did not stay. But do not ever say you are broken. You are the strongest thing in this valley." Lydia slumped against him, the tension draining from her body. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in her chest, but the shame was gone. "I love you," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Raven held her tighter. "I know, and I am you." While they held each other in the dim light of the wickiup, mourning a life that never was, the world outside was moving against them. A rider from Red Mesa had been spotted near the canyon entrance. He did not attack, he simply watched, sketching on a pad of paper, noting the location of the lodges, the number of horses, the daily routines. In the town, the printing press of the local gazette was clacking rhythmically. The headline, bold and black, screamed, "White bride held captive in Apache stronghold. A cry for help." Captain Mercer stood by the window of his office, watching the snow begin to fall on the parade ground. He held the signed affidavit from Reverend Thomas in his hand. "Soon," Mercer whispered to the glass. "Soon we will go and save her. And then, the valley is ours." The winter was approaching, and with it, a storm made of lies and steel that threatened to wash away the fragile home Lydia and Raven had built. The snow had melted, leaving the valley a vibrant, aching green. But the peace Lydia had found was about to be shattered by the thunder of civilization. It began not with a scream, but with the unnatural silence of the birds. Lydia was kneeling by the creek, washing a shirt, the icy water numbing her fingers. She paused, lifting her head. The robins that usually chattered in the cottonwoods had become quiet. The wind had shifted, carrying a scent that did not belong in the valley, the smell of gun oil, unwashed wool, and cheap tobacco. Then came the bugle. It was a harsh, brassy sound that tore through the morning mist. Before the echo had faded against the canyon walls, the ridge was lined with blue coats. "Soldiers!" a young boy screamed, dropping his fishing pole and sprinting toward the lodges. Lydia scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked toward the main camp. Raven was already there, emerging from his lodge with his rifle in hand. But he did not raise it. He stood frozen, looking up at the ridge. There were too many of them. Captain Mercer had not come with a patrol. He had come with a battalion. And behind the cavalry, positioned on the high ground, Lydia saw the terrifying silhouette of a Gatling gun. Its multiple barrels pointed directly at the women and children gathering in the center of the camp. "Do not fire!" Raven's voice roared out, cutting through the panic. He threw his hands up, signaling his warriors to stand down. "Hold your fire!" The cavalry thundered down the slope, hooves churning the soft earth into mud. They swept through the village like a flood, scattering chickens and overturning drying racks. Lydia began to run toward Raven, but a horse cut her off. "Mrs. Barrett!" a voice shouted. A soldier dismounted before his horse had fully stopped. Behind him was a woman in a heavy travel cloak, the wife of one of the lieutenants from the fort. She rushed at Lydia, grabbing her arm with a grip that was meant to be comforting but felt like a shackle. "Thank God we'd found you," the woman gasped, her eyes wide with a frantic, performative pity. "You are safe now, dear. We are here to get you out of this hell." "Let go of me!" Lydia screamed, twisting in her grasp. "I am not lost. I live here." "She is hysterical," the woman shouted to the soldier. "The savages have turned her mind. Get the wagon," Lydia fought. She raked her fingernails across the soldier's hand. She kicked at his shins. "Raven!" she screamed. "Raven!" Across the chaos, she saw him. 2 soldiers had seized him. They kicked his legs out from under him, forcing him to his knees in the mud. One of them struck him across the face with the butt of a rifle. Raven's head snapped back, blood flying from his lip, but he did not fight back. He looked past the soldiers, past the chaos, locking eyes with Lydia. He shook his head once, a barely perceptible movement. "Do not get yourself killed," the look said. "Survive?" "I am his wife," Lydia shrieked as the soldiers dragged her toward a covered wagon. "I am Lydia Raven. This is a legal marriage." "You are kidnapping me," Captain Mercer rode into the center of the circle. He looked down at Raven with a smile of utter triumph. "Arrest him," Mercer commanded, his voice cool and detached. "The charge is abduction, violation of the treaty, and holding a white woman against her will." "She is my wife," Raven spat, blood staining his teeth. "She chose this. Look at her," Mercer said, gesturing to where Lydia was being physically lifted into the wagon, thrashing and screaming. "Does that look like a woman who wants to stay? She is traumatized. She is suffering from the madness of captivity. You have broken her mind." He turned to his sergeant. "Chain him, and tell the tribe to pack their things. This valley is now a crime scene. The treaty is suspended pending a federal investigation. They have 3 days to vacate." "No!" Raven roared, struggling against the 3 men holding him down. "The treaty holds. The land is ours." The butt of the rifle descended again, striking Raven at the base of his skull. He crumpled into the mud, unconscious. "Drive on!" Mercer shouted to the wagon driver. The last thing Lydia saw as the canvas flap was tied shut was Nayeli standing by the fire, her face a mask of stone, watching the future of her people being dragged away in chains. Red Mesa had never looked so ugly to Lydia as it did when she returned. She was not taken to jail. That would have ruined the narrative. Instead, she was taken to the home of Reverend Thomas, a small, stifling house behind the church. She was placed in the guest room, which had bars on the window installed. She was told, for her own protection against the savages who might try to reclaim their prize. She was treated like a porcelain doll that had been dropped in the mud. The lieutenant's wife, Mrs. Gable, bathed her. She scrubbed Lydia's skin with a rough brush and lye soap until it was red and raw, as if trying to scour the Apache off her. "There, Mrs." Gable cooed, handing Lydia a stiff, starched dress with a high collar that choked her. "Now you look like a Christian woman again." "I want to see my husband," Lydia said. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. She felt hollowed out. "Mister, Thorne is dead. Dear." "Mrs.," Gable said gently, patting her hand. "My husband?" Lydia said, turning her cold gaze on the woman. "Raven." "Mrs." Gable flinched. "You must not say that name. It is the trauma talking. The doctor says your mind has constructed a fantasy to cope with the horror of your rape." "It was not rape," Lydia said, her voice low and dangerous. "It was love. Something you clearly know nothing about." "Mrs." Gable slapped her. It was a reflex, a sharp crack of shock. Then the woman gasped, covering her mouth. Oh, I am so sorry." You see what they have done to you. They have made you cruel." She fled the room, locking the door behind her. Hours later, the door opened again. This time it was a man in a pinstriped suit. He carried a briefcase and smelled of bay rum. "Miss Barrett," he said, sitting on the chair opposite her. "I am Arthur P. Sterling, attorney at law. I represent Mr. Gideon Hale and the railroad interests." "Get out," Lydia said. "I am here to help you," Sterling said, opening his briefcase. He pulled out a document. "We understand your confusion, but the law is clear. If you were coerced, the marriage is void. Mr. Hale is a generous man. He wants to set up a trust for you, $5,000, enough to return to Philadelphia, enough to buy a small house, a new life, a clean slate." He slid the paper across the small table. "All you have to do is sign this affidavit. It simply states that Raven threatened you, that you were afraid for your life, that the marriage was a performance to survive." Lydia looked at the paper. $5,000. It was a fortune. It was safe. It was the end of the whispering, the staring, the hunger, the cold. She could go back east. She could be a widow with means. No one would have to know about the miscarriage. No one would have to know about the nights in the wiki-up. "And if I sign?" Lydia asked. "What happened to him?" "He will be tried for kidnapping," Sterling said, shrugging. "He will likely hang, or be sent to the prison in Florida. The tribe will be moved to a reservation in the north. The valley will be opened for development." Lydia picked up the paper. She looked at the neat, black ink. It was a wall of lies built to look like justice. She remembered Raven's hands washing the blood from her legs. She remembered him saying, "You are enough." She ripped the paper in half. Then she ripped the halves. She threw the confetti of lies into Sterling's face. "Tell Mr. Hale," Lydia said, standing up, "that my honor is not for sale. And tell Captain Mercer that he should have killed me in the valley, because if he puts me on a witness stand, I will burn his world to the ground." Sterling stood up, brushing the paper from his coat. His face was red. "You are a fool, woman. You are choosing a noose." "Better a noose with a man," Lydia said, "than a silk leash with a dog." The hearing was held 3 days later in the only building large enough to hold the crowd, the Happy Jack Saloon. The bar had been cleared of bottles, and a heavy oak table served as the judge's bench. A federal circuit judge, Judge William H. Miller, had arrived on the stagecoach. He was a man with a face like a bloodhound, jowly and tired, known for a strict adherence to the letter of the law. The room was packed. Every miner, soldier, and whore in Red Mesa had squeezed in to see the show. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and anticipation. Lydia sat at a small table on the left. She was dressed in the severe gray dress Mrs. Gable had forced upon her. Her hands were folded in her lap, but her eyes were fixed on the door. The doors swung open. A hush fell over the room. Raven was led in. He was in chains. Heavy iron shackles bound his wrists and ankles. He had been beaten. His left eye was swollen shut, and his lip was split. They had stripped him of his beaded vest, leaving him in a torn cotton shirt. But he did not walk like a prisoner. He walked with his head high, the chains clanking a rhythm that sounded like a war drum. He scanned the room until he found Lydia. He did not smile, but his shoulders relaxed imperceptibly. "She is alive," his posture said. "She is here." Captain Mercer and Gideon Hale sat at the prosecution table, looking smug and untouchable. "This court is in session." Judge Miller banged a gavel. "We are here to determine the status of the Treaty of Red Mesa and the criminal charges against the Apache chief known as Raven." Mercer stood up. He played the part of the reluctant hero perfectly. "Your Honor," Mercer began, his voice smooth, "we do not relish this. We tried to live in peace, But we discovered a monstrous crime. This savage, he pointed at Raven, abducted a vulnerable white woman. He held her in squalor. He brainwashed her. He used her as a human shield to violate the treaty and occupy federal land. He called his witnesses. Reverend Thomas took the stand, sweating profusely. He swore on a Bible he had betrayed long ago. Yes, she came to me, he lied, dabbing his forehead. She was weeping. She said, "Save me, Reverend, before they take me." Then I saw her being dragged away by that man. The crowd murmured in anger. Then came the soldiers, who testified to the squalor of the camp, describing Lydia as filthy and starved when they found her. Lydia listened, her face a mask. She saw Raven listening too. He did not speak. He knew that in this room, his voice was the wind unheard and unwanted. "The prosecution rests," Mercer said, looking at the jury, 12 white men from the town. "Does the prisoner have counsel?" Judge Miller asked. "I speak for myself," Raven said. His voice was rasping, but clear. "I speak the truth, but you do not have ears for it." "The court calls Lydia Barrett," Mercer announced. "The victim—" Lydia stood up. The room went deadly silent. She walked to the front. She did not look at Mercer. She looked at Raven. "State your name," the judge said. Lydia turned to the crowd. She saw the faces of the people who had mocked her when she arrived. The people who had bet on her misery. "My name," she said, her voice ringing off the rafters, "is Lydia Raven. I am the wife of the chief." "Objection," Mercer shouted. "The witness is delusional." "Overruled," the judge said, leaning forward. "Let her speak." Lydia turned to the judge. "You want to know if I was captured?" "Yes, I was, but not by the Apache." She pointed a shaking finger at Mercer. "I was captured by the cruelty of this town. When I arrived here, destitute and alone, this man," she pointed at Mercer, "offered to sell me to his soldiers as a whore. That man," she pointed at Silas Crow in the back, "offered me a bed in his brothel." The crowd gasped. Mercer's face went purple. "I was trash to you," Lydia shouted, her composure cracking to reveal the fire beneath. "I was a barren woman, a canceled contract, a piece of refuse to be swept into the gutter. No white man in this town offered me a hand, not one." She walked over to Raven. She knelt beside him, ignoring the gasp of the crowd. She took his chained hands in hers. "This man," Lydia said, tears streaming down her face, "saw me when I was invisible. He offered me a home, not a cage. He asked for my partnership, not my submission. He wiped my tears when I lost our child." She turned back to the judge, her eyes blazing. "I was free in that valley. Your Honor, the only time I have been a prisoner is since Captain Mercer saved me." "She is lying," Gideon Hale shouted, standing up. "She is mad." "Am I?" Lydia reached into her pocket. She pulled out the small knife Raven had given her. The guards tensed, reaching for their guns. Lydia slammed the knife onto the judge's table. It stuck in the wood, quivering. "This is the knife of a wife," she said. "Ask any Apache. A captive is not given a weapon. A captive is not taught to ride. A captive does not choose to stay." The room was in chaos, but the climax was not over. "Your Honor," a voice shouted from the back. A young soldier, Private Dobbs, pushed his way through the crowd. He was the regimental clerk, a boy of 19 with acne and a conscience that had finally broken him. "Private, sit down," Mercer roared. "I have evidence." Dobbs shouted, waving a sheaf of papers. He ran to the judge's bench, dodging Mercer's outstretched hand. "I cannot let them hang him. Sir, I typed the telegrams myself." Judge Miller snatched the papers. He put on his spectacles. The room held its breath. The judge read silently. His face became darker with every line. Finally, he looked up. He looked at Mercer with a gaze that could peel paint. "These are telegrams," the judge said, his voice icy. "Dated 3 months ago, between Captain Mercer and Mr. Gideon Hale." He read aloud. "Plan proceeding. The girl is the perfect pretext. Once we manufacture the kidnapping charge, the treaty is void. Railroad rights secured. Your payment of $10,000 to be deposited upon eviction of the tribe." The silence that followed was heavier than the chains on Raven's wrists. Mercer went for his gun. It was a desperate, stupid reflex. Before he could clear the holster, 3 marshals had their pistols leveled at his head. "Captain Edward Mercer," Judge Miller said, his voice shaking with fury. "You are relieved of command. Marshal, place him under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and perjury. Take Mr. Hale as well, and grab that reverend before he slips out the back." Pandemonium erupted. Mercer was tackled. Hale was screaming about his lawyers. Amidst the swirling chaos, Lydia did not move. She stayed kneeling beside Raven. A marshal came over with a key. He looked at Raven, then at Lydia. He unlocked the shackles. The iron cuffs fell to the floor with a heavy clang. Raven rubbed his wrists. He stood up slowly, towering over the room. He did not look at the disgraced captain being dragged away. He looked at his wife. "You," Raven said, his voice rough with emotion, "are a storm. Lydia." Lydia stood, her knees weak, her face wet with tears. "I told you," she sobbed, a laugh breaking through the pain. "I will give you everything I have." Raven reached out and pulled her against him. He buried his face in her neck, breathing her in, ignoring the hundreds of people watching. In the center of the saloon, amidst the wreckage of the white man's conspiracy, the Apache chief and his white bride stood like a monolith, unbroken, unbowed, and undeniably united. The judge cleared his throat. "The charges are dismissed," he announced, banging the gavel so hard the handle cracked. "The treaty stands. The valley belongs to the people." Lydia looked up at Raven. The nightmare was over. But as she looked at the hostility still lingering in the eyes of the townspeople, she knew the battle for acceptance had only just begun, but they would fight it together. "Let us go home," Raven said. "Yes," Lydia whispered, picking up her knife from the judge's table. "Let us go home." The fallout from the trial in Red Mesa did not settle like dust. It crashed like falling timber, shaking the foundations of the town. Captain Mercer was stripped of his command within the hour. He was not allowed to return to his quarters to collect his personal effects. Instead, he was escorted to the guardhouse by the very men he had commanded, soldiers who now looked at him with a mixture of contempt and betrayal. He would face a court-martial in Santa Fe, and the charges conspiracy, fraud, and conduct unbecoming an officer carried a sentence that would ensure he never wore a uniform again. Gideon Hale fared little better. The revelation of the telegrams caused an immediate panic among his investors. The federal marshals seized his assets in the territory, pending a full investigation into his bribery of public officials. The railroad survey was halted, and the surveyors, unpaid and disillusioned, packed their transits and left on the next stagecoach. But the most significant victory was the piece of paper Judge Miller handed to Raven before they left the saloon. "This is a reaffirmation of the treaty," the judge said, his voice gravelly with fatigue. "It states clearly that the Serenity Valley remains Apache land. As long as you keep the peace, no man, soldier, or civilian may cross your borders without permission." The judge looked at Lydia, his eyes softening slightly. "And it recognizes your marriage as binding under territorial law. You are safe, Mrs. Raven, though I suspect you do not need my gavel to protect you." Lydia took the paper. It was light, fragile, yet it held the weight of their future. The ride back to the valley was different from the terrified journey Lydia had taken months ago, and different still from the prisoner's march she had endured days before. This time, she did not ride behind Raven. She rode beside him. Raven had traded a few of his remaining furs for a sturdy mare at the livery stable, a bay with a white star on her forehead. As they rode out of Red Mesa, the townspeople watched from the boardwalks. There were no jeers this time. No stones were thrown. There was only a silent, uneasy respect. They had seen the barren bride stand before a judge and pull a knife for her husband. They had seen the savage speak with more honor than their own captain. The sun was high when they reached the entrance to the canyon. The red rocks glowed with a fierce, welcoming heat. "Are you tired?" Raven asked, pulling his paint horse up alongside hers. "No," Lydia said, breathing in the scent of sage and freedom. "I'm awake." When they crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley, the scars of the raid were still visible. Drying racks lay overturned like bleached ribs. Patches of grass had been churned into mud by cavalry horses. But the smoke rising from the lodge poles was steady, and the herd of cattle was grazing peacefully by the creek. They rode into the camp. The people came out slowly. They did not cheer. The Apache were not a people given to loud displays after such danger. They stood in quiet rows, watching their leader return. Nayeli stepped forward. She leaned on a walking stick, her face looking older than Lydia remembered, etched with the stress of the last few days. Raven dismounted and went to her, bowing his head in respect. Nayeli touched his shoulder, her hand trembling slightly. Then, she turned her gaze to Lydia. Lydia swung down from her saddle. Her boots hit the earth. She waited, unsure of her reception. She had been the cause of this raid. After all, Nayeli walked up to her. The old woman's eyes searched Lydia's face, looking for the fear that used to live there. She found only resolve. "They said you were a captive," Nayeli said, her voice rasping like wind over stone. "I told them I was home," Lydia replied. Nayeli nodded slowly. You stood in the white man's stone house, surrounded by wolves, and you claimed us. Many would have taken the money and run back to the east." She reached out and took Lydia's hand, the hand that still bore the faint ink stain from the judge's table. "You have brought danger to us, yes," Nayeli said honestly. "But you also brought the shield that saved us. You are no longer a guest, water woman. You are a rib of this valley. You are the bone of our bones." It was not a hug. It was an induction. Lydia felt a lump form in her throat, harder to swallow than any grief. She squeezed the old woman's hand. "Thank you, grandmother," she whispered. The days that followed were filled with the labor of restoration. The threat of the railroad was gone for now, pushed back by the scandal. But the winter was fast approaching, and the raid had cost them precious time. Lydia threw herself into the work. She was everywhere. She helped the women restring the drying racks. She sorted through the winter stores, calculating how much corn and dried meat had been trampled or stolen by the soldiers, and how much they would need to trade for to survive the snows. She walked among the wounded warriors who had been struck with rifle butts, women who had been shoved. She applied the arnica salve Nayeli had taught her to make, binding ribs with strips of clean cloth. She spoke to them in a mix of English and the Apache phrases she was slowly mastering. The children, resilient as weeds, were the first to recover. Their laughter returned to the creek banks. They followed Lydia around, fascinated by the woman who had shouted at a judge. But beneath the busy activity, beneath the relief of safety, there was a quiet shadow that hung between Lydia and Raven. One evening, a week after their return, the camp was asleep. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky. Lydia could not sleep. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and walked down to the creek, to the spot where she'd been washing clothes the morning the soldiers came. The water rushed over the stones, indifferent to human sorrow. Lydia sat on a flat rock. Her hand drifted to her stomach. It was flat, empty. The adrenaline of the trial had masked the grief. But now, in the silence, it returned a dull, hollow ache. She thought of the tiny life that had slipped away before it had a name. She thought of the barren label that the town had tried to pin on her again. She heard the soft tread of moccasins behind her. She did not turn. She knew the rhythm of his walk. Raven sat down beside her. He did not touch her immediately. He simply offered his presence, a solid wall against the night. "The water is cold tonight," he said quietly. "It washes everything away," Lydia murmured. "Mud, blood, time, but it leaves the stones," Raven said. "The stones remain." He reached out and took her hand, uncurling her fingers from where they were clenched in her lap. "You are thinking of the little one," he said. It was not a question. "I am thinking," Lydia said, her voice trembling, "that we won. We beat the captain. We kept the land. We have a marriage paper that no one can dispute," But she looked at him, her eyes shining with tears in the moonlight. The cradle is still empty. Raven. And the doctor said? The doctor said it will likely always be empty. She waited for him to pull away. Even after everything, the old fear lingered, the fear that she was fundamentally broken, a dead end for his lineage. Raven picked up a small pebble and tossed it into the stream. It made a quiet plunk. "Do you know why I built the fire in the center of the lodge?" he asked. Lydia blinked, confused by the change of subject. "Because it is the Apache way, to keep the heat even. Because a fire in the center warms everyone who sits around it," Raven corrected. "It does not matter if they are blood relatives or a stranger who walked in from the cold. The fire does not ask who you are. It just gives." He turned to her, his dark eyes fierce and tender. "Lydia, you and I, we are the fire. If a child comes from your body, it is a blessing. If not, are we to let the fire go out? Are we to let the warmth go to waste because we are waiting for a specific guest?" Lydia looked at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Raven said, gesturing toward the darkened horizon, toward the town of Red Mesa and the borderlands beyond, "that the world is full of children who are cold. The illness takes care of parents. The war takes parents. In the town, I saw street urchins eating scraps from the saloon floor. In the border camps, there are little ones with no names." He squeezed her hand. "We have a valley. We have food. We have love that survived a trial. Why must the child be of our blood to be our son? Why must she be of our bone to be our daughter?" Lydia felt a door open in her heart, a door she had nailed shut years ago in Philadelphia. "You would do that?" she asked breathlessly. "You, a chief. You would raise a child that is not yours, perhaps a white child or a Mexican child. A child is a child," Raven said simply. "An arrow does not care who made it. It only cares whose hand guides it to the target. I will guide them. You will nurture them. They will be Apache because we say they are." Lydia looked at the creek. She imagined the wickiup not as a lonely place for two, but as a crowded, noisy chaos of small feet and loud voices. She imagined teaching a little girl to read, teaching a little boy to bake biscuits. "There is a boy," Lydia said suddenly. Her mind raced back to the town. "At the livery stable, he sweeps the stalls. He is 6 years old, maybe 7, half Apache, half white. The owner beats him. He sleeps in the hay." Raven nodded. "I have seen him. He has eyes like a hawk." "And there is a girl," Lydia continued, the hope rising in her chest like a bubble. "In the mission orphanage near the fort. Her parents died on the trail. She does not speak. The nuns say she is difficult. Then she will fit in well with us," Raven said with a dry smile. Lydia laughed, a sound that broke the melancholy of the night. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Let us fill the house, Raven," she whispered. "Let us fill it until the walls burst." "We will need a bigger house," Raven noted. The building of the house became the symbol of their new reality. It was Raven's design, a testament to the marriage of their two cultures. He did not want a dark, smoky wickiup for his wife, nor did he want a stifling, square box like the white settlers built. They chose a spot near the bend of the creek, under the shade of 3 massive cottonwood trees. Raven felled the pine trees himself, stripping the bark with long, rhythmic strokes of his axe. Lydia worked beside him. She was no longer the delicate woman in the gray silk dress. She wore a skirt of buckskin that she had sewn herself, and a loose cotton shirt. Her hair was braided down her back, Apache style. Together, they dragged the logs. Together, they mixed the mud and straw for chinking. "This wall," Raven said, laying the foundation of the north side, "will be of heavy logs, like the white man's fort, to block the cold wind. And the roof," Lydia insisted, pointing up. "It must have a smoke hole, a wide one, for the fire in the center." "Agreed," Raven said. The structure that rose was unique. It was octagonal, mirroring the shape of a traditional hogan, but built with the permanence of a log cabin. It had a heavy wooden door with iron hinges. Lydia's request for security, but it faced east, toward the rising sun, Raven's requirement for blessing. The tribe watched with amusement and then with admiration. Warriors came to help lift the heavy roof beams. Women came to help pack the mud into the cracks. One afternoon, Lydia was knee-deep in mud, mixing the clay with her bare feet, her face smeared with dirt, laughing as she tried to keep her balance. Naili walked by. She stopped and watched Lydia. "You are dirty," Naili observed. "It is good mud, grandmother," Lydia replied, breathless. "It is honest mud," Naili corrected. "You are building a nest. That is good. A nest needs to be strong." Naili paused, then added, "The boy at the livery stable? Miguel says the stable master is looking to sell him for the price of a horse. He says the boy eats too much." Lydia stopped moving. She looked at Naili. "2 horses," Naili said firmly. "That is a fair price for a son. I have a roan gelding I do not ride. You take it." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. It was an offer of dowry. It was the tribe investing in her family. "Thank you," Lydia whispered. "Do not thank me," Naili grunted, walking away. "Just make sure the boy learns to fetch water. I am too old to carry it." The house was finished before the first heavy snow. It smelled of fresh pine resin and drying clay. A fire burned brightly in the central pit, the smoke spiraling up through the hole in the roof, keeping the room warm and sweet. In the corner, near the sleeping furs which were piled high and thick, stood a new object. Raven sat on a stool, a chisel in his hand. He was working on a piece of seasoned oak. Lydia sat nearby, mending a shirt by the light of the fire. She watched his hands. He was carving a cradle. It was not the delicate, spindly cradles of the East. It was a cradle board, sturdy and protective, meant to be carried on a back or hung from a saddle. But Raven was carving the wooden frame with intricate detail. He blew the dust away from the wood. "Look," he said. Lydia leaned forward. Carved into the wood was a landscape. There were mountains, sharp, jagged peaks like the ones guarding their valley. There was a horse running free, its mane flying in the wind, and above it all, a hawk soaring. "It is beautiful," Lydia said. Raven ran his thumb over the horse. "I make this not for a ghost," he said quietly. "I make this for the ones who are coming." He looked up at her. "Miguel rides to town tomorrow. He takes the 2 horses. He will bring the boy." Lydia's heart gave a leap of terrified joy. "And the girl? The nuns are harder to trade with." Raven grinned. "But I suspect if the famous Lydia Raven goes to speak with them, they will find it hard to say no to a woman who defeated a captain." Lydia reached out and touched the cradle. For months, looking at a cradle had caused her physical pain a reminder of her failure, her emptiness. Now, looking at the sturdy oak, the lovingly carved mountains, she felt only anticipation. It was empty now. Yes, but it was an emptiness that promised to be filled. It was a space waiting for love, not a void demanding it. "It is a good cradle," Lydia said. "It looks safe." "It is," Raven said. He set the chisel down and pulled her onto his lap. The firelight flickered over their faces, one copper, one pale, both lined by the sun and the wind. "Will you give me sons?" Raven whispered, repeating the old question, but with a new, playful lightness. Lydia rested her head against his shoulder. She looked at the cradle, then at the sturdy walls of the house they had built with their own hands. "I will give you a family." "Raven," she answered. "By blood or by bond. I will give you a house that is never quiet. I will give you a love that outlasts the stone." Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, settling on the roof of the strange, beautiful house in the valley. But inside, the fire was burning, and the cradle was rocking gently, ready for the life that was about to begin. 5 years had passed since the gavel struck the table in the Happy Jack saloon, and the Serenity Valley had changed. It was no longer just an Apache stronghold, hidden and defensive. It had become something new, a place that did not exist on any government map, but lived and breathed in the reality of the high desert. The cluster of wickiups had grown. Interspersed among the traditional rounded structures were several log cabins, built with the same octagonal design Raven and Lydia had pioneered. They were sturdy homes, built to withstand the winter snows and the spring winds, blending the wisdom of the Apache with the permanence of the settlers. The railroad, after the scandal involving Gideon Hale and the sheer legal headache of the treaty, had eventually chosen a southern route, bypassing the valley by 50 miles. The iron horse roared in the distance, a faint whistle in the wind, but it did not tear through their grazing lands. The valley remained a sanctuary, suspended in a fragile but enduring peace. On a warm afternoon in late spring, Lydia stood on the porch of her home. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving streaks of white flour on the fabric. The smell of baking bread drifted from the open door, mixing with the scent of blooming sage and horse sweat. She shaded her eyes against the sun, looking toward the corral. "Keep your heels down. Thomas," Raven's voice carried across the yard, authoritative but laced with laughter. "And do not pull the reins. Talk to him with your knees." In the paddock, a boy of 7 years sat atop a patient roan mare. Thomas had dark skin and eyes that had seen too much sorrow. Before he came to the valley, his father died from smallpox. His mother lost to the harshness of the border. But now, his face was split in a wide grin as he trotted the horse in a circle. Running behind him, shouting encouragement, was a little girl with hair the color of spun gold. This was Sarah, the orphan from the mission. She was 5 years old, fierce as a badger, and she refused to speak English, preferring the Apache tongue she had absorbed like a sponge. "Faster, Papa!" Sarah yelled in Apache. "Make him fly." Lydia smiled, a deep warmth spreading through her chest. "Papa." The word came so easily to them now. Raven looked up, catching Lydia's eye from across the yard. He tipped his wide-brimmed hat, his face crinkling with a smile that softened the harsh white scar on his cheek. He looked older. There were silver threads in his black hair now, and the lines around his eyes were deeper, but he looked lighter, as if the weight of the sky he carried had been shared. A wagon rattled down the track leading to the main house. It was Miguel, driving a buckboard loaded with sacks of grain and bolts of cloth from Red Mesa. Beside him sat Judge Miller, now retired, who made the journey twice a year to trade tobacco for Raven's horses. "Mrs. Raven," Miguel called out, waving his hat. "I brought the sugar you asked for, and the judge brought news from Santa Fe." Lydia walked down the steps to greet them. She moved a little slower these days, her hand resting unconsciously on the curve of her stomach. Under the gray calico of her dress, there was a swelling, a quiet, miraculous swelling. She was 4 months along. For years, her womb had been silent. She and Raven had filled their home with Thomas and Sarah, pouring their love into children who needed them, believing that was their destined path. And it was. They were a complete family. But then, the winter had been long and cold, and the nights were warm under the buffalo robes, and the spirits had decided to offer one more surprise. This time, there was no panic. There was no desperate praying in the dark, no feeling that her worth hung in the balance. If this baby arrived safely, it would be loved. If the spirits took it back before it drew breath, they would grieve, but they would not break. Their house was already built on rock, not sand. "Welcome, Judge," Lydia said, reaching up to shake the old man's hand. "You are just in time for fresh bread. I smelled it from the canyon." "Lydia," the judge chuckled, climbing down stiffly. He looked around the valley at the Apache women weaving baskets by the creek, at the white traders haggling over horses near the corral, at the children of 2 races playing tag in the long grass. "Every time I come here," the judge said, shaking his head, "I expect to find it gone. I expect the world to have crushed it. And every time, it is stronger. Roots go deep here. Judge," Lydia said simply. Later that evening, after the trade was done and the guests had departed or settled into the guest lodge, the valley quieted. The sun dipped below the peaks, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges, the eternal colors of the West. Lydia sat on the bench outside their door. She held her mother's gold locket in her hand, rubbing her thumb over the smooth metal. On her wrist, Next to the pale skin of her arm sat the turquoise and silver bracelet Raven had made for her first anniversary. The locket held the past Boston, tea parlors, a mother who worried about propriety. The bracelet held the present earth, sky, and a husband who worried about rainfall and treaties. Two worlds, once impossible to reconcile, now resting side by side on her pulse. Raven came out of the house. He had put the children to bed, a nightly ritual involving stories of Coyote and the stars that usually ended with Sarah falling asleep mid-sentence. He sat beside her, stretching his long legs out. He took the locket from her hand, closing his fingers over hers. "Are they asleep?" Lydia asked softly. "Thomas is dreaming of galloping," Raven said. "His legs are twitching like a dog's. Sarah is asleep, but she is holding her knife. I tried to take it, but she growled at me." Lydia laughed. "She is your daughter, through and through." "She has your stubbornness," Raven countered, smiling. He shifted, his hand moving from her hand to rest gently on the swell of her stomach. The touch was revered, filled with wonder, but free of the heavy demand that had haunted their first meeting. "He kicked today," Lydia said. "When the judge arrived." "He knows the law is coming," Raven joked. Then his voice became quiet, intimate. "How do you feel?" "I feel whole," Lydia said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, smelling the familiar scent of wood smoke and leather. "I used to think I had to be fixed. Raven, I thought I was a broken thing that needed to be repaired by a child." She looked out at the darkened valley, where the fireflies were beginning to dance over the creek. "But I wasn't broken," she continued. "I was just empty. And you filled my life before this baby ever existed." Raven turned his face into her hair. "Do you remember the question?" he murmured. "The one I asked you that day at the hotel, when the wolves were circling." "Will you give me sons?" Lydia recited, the words now a sweet memory rather than a terrifying contract. "I was a fool," Raven said softly. "I asked for fruit when I should have asked for the tree." He kissed her temple. "You have given me more than sons. Lydia, you gave me Thomas. You gave me Sarah. You gave me a peace that allows my people to sleep without guns in their hands." He pulled her closer. "You gave me a home." Lydia turned in his arms, looking up into the face that had once terrified her with its fierceness, now the most beautiful sight in her world. "And you, Raven," she whispered. "You gave me the one thing no man in the East ever thought I deserved. And what is that?" "The choice," Lydia said. "You let me choose to stay. You let me choose to fight. You let me choose to love." They sat in silence as the stars wheeled overhead. The vast, indifferent universe watching over their small, defiant patch of warmth. Inside the house, in the corner near the fire, the cradle Raven had carved 5 years ago stood ready. It was lined with soft deerskin and a quilt Lydia had stitched from scraps of her old life and new. It rocked gently in the draft from the open door. Inside it, there was no baby yet, but draped over the side was Sarah's doll, and resting in the bottom was a wooden horse Tomas had carved. It was a vessel that held the history of their family, the adopted, the unborn, the hoped for, and the already loved. The wind from the canyon blew through the door, carrying the scent of rain and the distant cry of a coyote. It pushed the cradle, making it sway back and forth, a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. The Wild West was still there, just outside the door. It was still dangerous, still hard, still unforgiving. But here, in this house built of pine and mud, between a woman who had been thrown away and a chief who refused to break, there was something stronger than the wild. There was a home, and that was enough. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey walking the dusty trails of Red Mesa with Lydia and Raven. I hope their story of resilience and love touched your heart as much as it did mine. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel across the world. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to the Wild West Tales channel, hitting that like button, and smashing the hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Your support keeps the campfire burning and the stories coming. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.